Hey guys, it's Liv here, and in today's video, we're finally doing the abilities tier list for every ability in the game. This will include abilities whether they are broken, niche, specific to one Pokemon, useless and competitive, whatever. We're ranking every ability as of Pokemon Sword and Shield. And if you guys enjoy this tier list content, you want to see more like it, we'll have part 2 on Friday, but leave a like on this video and subscribe for more, so that way then you don't miss part 2 when it goes live on Friday, or any of our other content for that matter. But with that said, let's really quickly break down how we're ranking the abilities, because I did have to phrase this a little bit better. I wanted to make it very clear how I was ranking these, because we're going to have 267 abilities. I counted them, actually 266 abilities. I counted them all out. We're doing A through M in this video and N through Z in the second one. It was like within 6 off. It was 136 in this one and 130 in the second. So I thought that was pretty fair. It's an easier number to remember too. So basically, here's how I'm gonna go. The very top tier, these would be considered like our S tiers. I labeled these as should not exist, and I labeled each category this time since I figured that was pretty easy to do with this. It's not just a collection of me listing off like 6 different tiers of the Pokemon is topping or whatever and making some text wall. So these top tier abilities, these are like our S pluses, these should not exist. Our S tiers are labeled as top tier abilities. These are abilities that I would say have absolutely no drawback, and not only that, but you're hurting yourself not running them because of how good they are. These are abilities that have no consequences. They are some of the best abilities that are not ban-worthy enough to where they just should not exist. For strong abilities, these are for abilities that you typically would be using on a Pokemon, but you're not necessarily going to be just using these because there's no reason not to. There might be a niche situation, or maybe a Pokemon has 2 of these abilities where you might be choosing between. For average abilities, these are abilities where I would say like a Pokemon would be pretty passable using this ability, and you would never really, at least you might have a downside for it, but you wouldn't really be extremely screwed over running it, if that makes sense. For niche abilities, these really only have a couple cases they would be good in, but they might do really well in that specific instance. For doesn't affect competitive, these are abilities like Paul Fetch, for example, which we'll get into pretty soon, where they just outright do nothing in competitive, but they're not harmful either. And detrimental is our bottom tier, these are our F tiers. They outright hurt you by running these abilities. So with that said, we're going to start off with adaptability, already starting off really strong actually, and I would put adaptability in the strong ability tier. Now, adaptability as a concept I think is actually a really incredible offensive ability, but I do think that there are a couple of things that this does lack in comparison to other abilities. For one, let's say we are comparing this to, well, actually, yeah, let's make the comparison. We'll weigh the pros and cons compared to other abilities of the same nature. If we were to compare this to an ability like Huge Power, for example, adaptability would gain the ability to boost both the physical and special offenses. So for a mixed attacker, this might be a better ability. However, on the downside though, you're only getting the boost for your stab. And if we look at adaptability Pokemon, the distribution, I'll be honest, isn't really great outside of really just the Megas. They're the 2 top tier examples. From there, it goes down to Pokemon like Crawdaunt and Porygon-Z, which they're not bad by any means, but there's definitely a lot better Pokemon than these, even with the ability. They had to be balanced by stats. Well, actually, Porygon-Z is a pretty decent stat line. It's just kind of carried because it's a pure normal type. But that's sort of the thing, is that I feel like with adaptability, the distribution's enough to where it's not necessarily breaking this ability by any means. Now, I will say the adaptability is still really good, but we've even seen this ability actually in tiers such as almost any ability, where everything can run this ability, and those Pokemon typically have a lot better stabs, and they're still not really breaking the tier just because there's a lot better examples. So we're gonna give this a strong ability. For Aerolite gets the strong ability as well actually, and I'm gonna put any of the 8s, I'll mention that right now. All the 8 abilities get this. Just being able to change normal into an actual stab for a lot of these Pokemon is really incredible, especially in a case like Mega Salamence, for example, where its best flying moves are Hurricane and Fly. And while Hurricane's not terrible for a physical attacker, you're not, or at least a primarily physical attacker, I should say, you're typically wanting some actual physical flying move. And with Fly, you're clicking Fly, and then you give your opponent the turn to switch into their flying resistance. With Aerolite, though, you give Mega Salamence, for example, an ability to use moves like Body Slam, Facade, and Double Edge, respectively, or even return in past generations or national dex Ubers, to where you now have an actual flying move that's not as much of a drawback. Even with Double Edge, it's really good in Ubers because despite the recoil you'd be taking, it's a good way to 2-KO a lot of Pokemon because there's not great flying resists. So easy strong ability tier, or easy A tier. For the Aftermath, Aftermath is a niche ability, I would say. This is decent for when you're taking contact moves, and it's a good way to get some good damage on your opponent. However, you basically need to die to contact to use this, and typically there's a better ability. For example, even on Skuntank, there's the ability Stench, Drifloon has the ability Unburden, so I wouldn't say that this is necessarily some really strong or average ability. I think it has cases where it can be more beneficial, but typically it would be utilized more so on a Pokemon that you're trying to sack, I think, in my opinion. For example, maybe Garbodor might use this, or even Skuntank if they're more of a suicide lead set. I think that would apply a lot more so to Garbodor though, because it would be running like a Focus Sash Spikes build at that point. But typically though, again, there's a better ability, and I think that every Pokemon that runs this is a better one, but I could think of cases where this is an outright useless. So this gets the C tier, or niche ability. For Airlock, this would be an average ability, I would say. Being able to clear weather is actually pretty useful. We've seen weather top several formats, and this basically is the same function as an ability such as Cloud 9, which is just another named version of it. But Airlock has the ability to clear any sort of weather from the field the second that you enter. This is really useful actually, because it just outright negates something. For example, with Rayquaza using Airlock, if you're in the sun, your water moves are doing the same damage they would have done if sun wasn't up. On the flip side though, you also don't gain the damage boost, so if you're clicking V-Create on Rayquaza, you can't get the sun boost from that. So it's a bit of a mixed bag, I would say, and that's kind of why I'm thinking it's in the average tier, because while Rayquaza is able to use this to take out a lot of different weather sweepers, since your 95 speed outpaces pretty much all of them, besides like a Barraskewda, and I guess Whimsicott technically, but no one really runs Chlorophyll Whimsicott. But otherwise you're speed tying or outpacing a lot of these weather sweepers, and that's pretty beneficial. But Rayquaza also has a lot of moves that it would love to actually take advantage of with the weather, such as, for example, Hurricane on rain teams or V-Create on sun teams, and it can't actually do so. So I'd give it average. I don't think it really hurts Rayquaza, but it also, just in cases, it is just the less beneficial ability, I guess, for a Pokemon that only has one. So we'll give it average. Next is Analytic. This also actually gets an average tier. I think that one of the cool things about Analytic is this is a really good way for slower Pokemon to do some increased damage. However, at the same time though, a lot of these analytic Pokemon don't actually typically take advantage of the ability that well, albeit there are some cases that actually do take advantage of this. For example, Magnezone is typically actually not a bad analytic user on Choice Spec sets, or you can typically use this on a Pokemon like Beheeyem and Trick Room, for example. However, at the same time, the fact that you do need to be hit first, or at the very least move last in a turn, is definitely a detriment. You can use this, to be fair, for a Pokemon that switches out. I believe it works the same way that something like a Fisher's Friend would, where if your opponent switches out, you're fine because you did move last in that turn. So I do think that that's at least something that's not terrible for Analytic, but at the same time, I still think that there's enough better abilities that boost damage to where I would just put this one in average. Anger Point, this gets a niche. I will say though, Anger Point actually did get a noteworthy user this generation with Crocodile, I believe was the noteworthy one, where you would typically switch in on Choice Bandit or Shifu's going for Wicked Blow, and you would revenge off Crocodile that way by getting a +6 set on a Scarf build, when your opponent was most likely locked into Wicked Blow at that point. And Crocodile also outpaced a lot of the Adamant Scarf builds or the Adamant Bandit builds with Choice Scarf Jolly, so it was actually not a terrible Pokemon for this regard. However, it's one of those things where Crocodile also benefits a lot more from running an ability like Intimidate in most cases, or even like a Moxie set would be beneficial more so than Anger Point in a lot of matchups. So it's definitely niche, but it's a niche ability that actually did have a very viable case in OU. So I think it's one of the better ones, but with how many abilities we're going to be sorting, I'm not ranking these in anything else than just the order that we're placing them in. So it gets a C tier. Anticipation's up next. This is a good ability for scouting for your opponent's attack that it would use. This would mostly be, for example, just trying to figure out a super effective attack. So if you're 4 times weak to something and your opponent has a really niche coverage option, it's pretty good for scouting that at least. However, at the same time, a lot of these Pokemon, again, just have significantly better abilities, and it's really only useful, in my opinion, if you are worried about a really rare coverage option. Otherwise, it's going to kind of just be it's not going to be rocket science. For example, if you bring this in like a Toxicroak and you bring this in on a Landorus Therian, clearly it's going to have Earthquake for you, and it's clearly going to massacre you. You're not really getting a lot of information from that, so I would say this is pretty niche. It gets a niche ability tier. Arena Trap. Arena Trap's our first top tier ability. Arena Trap has the ability to just trap your opponents, and as long as they're not running a Shud Shell, a Flying type, or I believe Ghost types also get around Arena Trap, you're getting trapped, which is honestly really amazing. Trapping is one of those mechanics that in Pokemon is actually, in my opinion, one of the best things you can actually provide for a team. Being able to essentially make a game a 5v6 at any point that you want by just getting rid of whatever key wall your opponent has, or maybe a really key sweeper that they have, or avenging them with Scarf Dugtrio, or whatever you choose to do really at that point, it's up to you. But I think that trapping Pokemon do enough in the metagame to where they're actual monsters, and especially as far as like an Uber's tiering goes, these Pokemon like Dugtrio and Gothitelle stand such a chance against some of the massive like S tier threats because they can just outright pick them off with a Scarf set, or by just setting up like Cosmic Power in Goth's case. So I know Shadow Tag is basically the same vein. We'll get into that when we do the second half of the tier list, obviously, but both trapping abilities are easily top tier abilities, at least for Arena Trap and Shadow Tag. Magnet Pull is a different case, but we'll get into that when we get to the tier. For now though, Arena Trap, as I said, it's a pretty uncompetitive ability, but I don't think it shouldn't exist actually. I think it treads the line of should not exist, I'll be honest, but I think it's really only outright broken in singles. As far as doubles goes, I think that the ability to 2-on-1 a Shadow Tag or Arena Trap Pokemon does actually help a lot with balancing this mechanic. I think it's one of those things where Pokemon clearly designed this for their doubles metagame, which is the metagame that they push, but it doesn't really actually work in any sense for balancedness in a single setting, just because of how easy it is to kind of just bring that Pokemon in and your opponent has no other Pokemon that might match up well. For example, if I bring in Dugtrio and Electric type in singles, they're trapped and they're going to be screwed over. However, if I bring in my Dugtrio and Electric type in doubles, my opponent might have a partner Pokemon that can at least trade 1-for-1 with my Dugtrio that turn, whereas otherwise in singles I could just keep switching out Dugtrio and keep picking up Pokemon that have a bad matchup against it until I have a Pokemon that has no counterplay. So that's really the distinction there, and I do think it's an important point to note, and it's why I don't put this in the should not exist tier. So S tier. Aromavale. Aromavale actually gets a solid B tier in the average ability sense. I think the Aromavale is honestly, in my personal opinion, a really decent ability for defensive Pokemon. This avoids like Taunt, for example, which is really useful when you're trying to go for like a Wish set, or maybe you're trying to set up for like a Calm Mind Sweep, who knows. But I do think that Aromavale definitely has a lot of defensive utility, and I kind of wish we got a Pokemon with better stats, considering right now, I believe that Aromatisse is like the best Pokemon with this ability. So I would love, yeah, it's like Aromatisse and Alcremie, both of which aren't really that great. Alcremie's decent as a Gmax spawn, but even still, you're not really clicking status on Gmax, so it doesn't matter. The point being is that I do think this is a really good ability, and I kind of wish we got a really good Pokemon with it, like something around the 530, 540 BST range, because I think that would actually be really nice to see. For now though, even still, this is just an average ability. As one, should not exist. I'm not even going to get into this. A Nerve plus Moxie or Shadow, or a Nerve plus Grimnay or Chillingnay, just outright broken. This is an outright uncompetitive ability in my opinion. Being able to gain offensive boost while making sure your opponent can't even lower berry past this, just flat out should not exist. There's no denying this ability is just outright uncompetitive. I don't even want to hear anyone try and justify it in the comments. I will make you embarrassed for commenting that. It's not competitive. Just flat out not competitive. Aura Break is a niche ability, I would say. This is kind of, it's one of those things where I would make a case that this is so niche it doesn't affect competitive, but technically it does have an impact, because for Yveltal and Xerneas, they lose their Fairy Aura and Dark Aura. But at the same time though, Yveltal still typically 1v1s with toxic sets, or with just clicking Dark Pulse enough times, and Xerneas still massacres us with Moonblast anyway, so I don't even really think it actually has an impact, but technically there's a presence it makes, so I can't just not put it in niche, even if it's such an underwhelming presence. So we'll give it niche. For Bad Dreams, I would say that Bad Dreams is also kind of a niche ability. You basically need to put your Pokemon, well, your opponent's Pokemon to sleep, which in most cases with Darkrai, at least in singles, and I'm using singles because Darkrai is yet to actually be allowed in a VGC metagame, and it's the only Pokemon with this ability. But typically you can't really actually reliably put your opponent to sleep unless you're using a second Pokemon to do so. So you would need to prepare the opponent with something else, like a Spore user, like a Mungus, for example, to then put the opponent to sleep more reliably, because Darkrai is doing it with 55% accurate moves, like Hypnosis. And then at that point, you're just kind of seeing if you can keep them asleep long enough to actually get the Bad Dreams damage over time. So I think it falls into one of those things where there's too many variables to set up to where I don't even think this actually is really a useful ability or like an average ability. It's just kind of niche in my opinion, but it doesn't impact Darkrai in a negative sense. I just think it doesn't offer anything either. Ball Fetch is up next, doesn't affect competitive. Battery's up next, this is a niche ability. It's decent for doubles, but at the same time, the fact that the only Pokemon with Battery is Charge-a-Bug, it's not great because Charge-a-Bug is an NFE. However, it's a decent boost you actually give the opponent. The partner Pokemon, it boosts their special attack by 1.3, which is basically an added Life Orb boost just by being next to them. It's pretty decent. However, I will say the fact that you do need to run Charge-a-Bug for it is pretty detrimental. And as far as, I'm trying to think. So as far as Battery Pokemon go, I do think it kind of makes sense because it's one of those things where at least at the time, this would have been a really good Pokemon as far as offensiveness goes. And also it's pretty decent as far as if you compare it to something like a Friend Guard, because Friend Guard was used on an NFE Pokemon and Clefairy ends up actually getting usage off of it. So I can kind of get why the logic was to give this another NFE Pokemon because it's just the offensive version of Friend Guard. But I still think there's actually even just an outright better version of this that's not on an NFE Pokemon that we'll get into in next week's video. So I don't really think that there's an actual reason to use this specifically for Battery, because there's an ability that just gives both the physical and special attack a 1.3, and Battery's only special. So we'll give this niche to get to C tier. Battle Armor is decent. Avoiding crits is actually really good. I'm gonna give this an A tier for the strong abilities. Being able to avoid crits is actually a really underrated thing in my personal opinion. Making sure that you're never actually susceptible on a setup sweeper. So, and we've actually seen this time and time again from Pokemon like Mega Slowbro, which in Nat decks at the very least have potentially run Calm Mind sets on Shell Armor, which is just the same ability renamed. But typically, you can pull this off with Calm Mind variants, and your opponent can no longer crit past your special defense boost. Your physical defense is really high at that point. And even as far as Battle Armor Pokemon goes, we see this typically not necessarily becoming a bad ability. At least I wouldn't say this is like a really strong ability, but Pokemon like Phalanx, for example, could potentially take advantage of this on no retreat sets, or you could see this potentially utilized on Pokemon such as Type Null, which have Battle Armor as their only ability, but in tandem with a Violite, it just can't get crit through, which is honestly really amazing to make this a really bulky low tier Pokemon. So I think the ability in itself is a really strong ability. Even Pokemon like Drapion can typically uses some more defensive builds to just avoid crits, which is great. I wouldn't say this is a top tier ability though, but the potential to just not be crit, it takes one of the most annoying mechanics besides like freeze out of the equation. Sign me up. Battle Bond is a really strong ability. I would definitely say this is just a strong ability though. Ash Greninja is decent, but I don't think it's decent enough to where I think the biggest logic is the fact that you kind of have to choose this over Protean. And while both of them are really good abilities for Greninja, it's one of those things where I think that the only reason that both Greninjas are as good as they are is because you kind of have to play the 50-50 of Battle Bond or Protean. And I think it's one of those things where Protean makes Battle Bond by extension better because of the fact that counterplay is a little bit different depending on the set. So I think Battle Bond in itself is just a strong ability. In tandem with Greninja, for having Protean as another option, you could maybe make a case that it's top tier. But I think that just off of Battle Bond exclusively, I'm going to put it in the strong ability sense. And it's purely just because of the fact that I think Ash Greninja on a standalone, it's still a really strong Pokemon, but you need to claim the KO to pop this first anyway, and Protean Greninja at least can immediately be useful. So again, I think it's one of those things where it's not even just the outright better option on Greninja, and I think that Greninja as well only makes it such a good ability because you have to play the 50-50. So, strong ability. Beast Boost, this gets a top tier ability. I think especially on Pokemon such as Celesteela and Buzzwole or Pheromosa, where you can actually tailor the boost into what stat you need very easily, which most Beast Boost Pokemon can at least tailor between 2 or 3, is really incredible. For example, Buzzwole, if you want it to be a more defensive Pokemon, you could throw the investment in Fizz-Def and make it gain Fizz-Def boosts. Or if you want to go with more of a Choice Scarf set, you can throw the boost in attack and gain an offensive boost. The point being is that on a Pokemon like Buzzwole, Naganadel, Pheromosa, you could choose what stat you actually want boosted, and you could start snowballing teams that way. On Pheromosa, for example, typically you'll see a speed boosting set, but maybe on a choice set, maybe on a Choice Scarf set, you'll go for the offensive boost instead. There's really no actual... There's very few Pokemon that really can't take advantage of the Beast Boost in the stat that they want to. Even Pokemon like Blacephalon, which you would typically on paper think can only gain speed, can invest their special attack IVs to where they'll gain, they'll typically gain special attack, but they'll invest their special attack IVs to lower them enough to where speed is now the boosting stat. So again, it's one of those things that if you're really creative, you can actually make this ability work in your favor and gain a variety of stats. And I think that's a benefit this has over something like a Moxie or a Speed Boost, where you're only gaining one stat. And while you're guaranteeing gaining that one stat, even if it's not your highest, I think a Beast Boost having that adaptability, I guess, for lack of a better word, is really strong for it, because you don't know until the opponent's already gained the boost what stat they'll gain. So in my opinion, this is a top tier ability. Berserk's up next. Gain a special attack stat every time that you drop below half. It's honestly a really good ability. I think the fact that you're able to just consistently gain special attack every time you drop below 50, and at the very least, you can still take advantage of this even if you do recover up. Even if you switch Pokemon out, you can gain the boost later by dropping again below 50. I think it's pretty incredible. I think the one downside though is the fact you can't pop this with hazards, but well, hazards are status, it has to be a damaging move, but even still, it's still honestly really incredible, because a lot of Pokemon will just go for damage in Pokemon like Galar Moltres, for example, which is a really strong Pokemon to take advantage of Berserk. So I would say this is a strong ability. Big Pex is up next. Big Pex, I believe it just stops the opponent from going for physically defensive lowering. I would say this is niche. It's not outright useless, but it's not an ability you're really ever trying to use. We have Blaze up next. Blaze gives you a fire type boost for 1.5, I believe. I forget the exact boost amount, I'll be honest. It's one of those things you don't really actually use Blaze. Yeah, it's 1.5 once you're at a third or below. It's not bad in theory. I just think that a lot of these Pokemon get better abilities. For example, Infernape gets Iron Fist, which on physical builds is at least better. It's probably one of the ones you would arguably be most inclined to use Blaze over its hidden ability. But with something like Blaziken, you get Speed Boost. With Typhlosion, you get Flash Fire. With Charizard, Solar Power. So I think it's just one of those things where typically it's just the worst ability to run. But it's not that useless. I would still put all the starter abilities in niche, to be honest, but I could get the case. Bulletproof's up next. This stops moves like Shadow Ball, Sludge Bomb, etc. from being used. I think it's pretty decent, and actually we see this useful on a Pokemon like, for example, Chestnut, which doesn't actually take Sludge Bomb when it would otherwise be weak to it. Or Ursaluna got this ability actually, and it is now immune to Focus Blast if you run that. So I think it's actually a pretty decent ability in theory. I think that just some of these Pokemon have better abilities, but on a Pokemon like Chestnut, this is probably your best choice, and it's actually pretty useful on it. So I would say this is pretty average. Cheek Pouch, when you're below, I think when you're using a berry, that Cheek Pouch gives you, I want to say, so Cheek Pouch, when you eat a berry, you gain 1/3 of your HP back. Okay, in addition to whatever the berry's effect is. It's a pretty decent ability. I would say this is mostly useful on Belly Drum Pokemon or just citrus Pokemon in general. I would say it's average. I think that there's definitely better abilities even as far as berry sets go. I forget what, I know that there's definitely another berry-related ability. Stuffed Cheeks is what I'm looking for. Oh, no, Stuffed Cheeks is actually the move, my bad. Well, even still, Gluttony, actually. Gluttony was the one I was thinking of. Gluttony gives you, when you're at half or below, you can potentially consume Super Berries at the very least quicker, which is really useful because those gain you back so much HP. And I think that's, in general, a more useful ability, even despite the Super Berry nerf. So I think they're both average, to be fair, but I think that it's slightly better. They're both still pretty decent abilities. Chilling Knight, just Reskin Moxie, generally just an A tier ability. They're all these abilities that are in this sort of vein are going to get A tier, because I think that Beast Boost just outright classes them because of the fact that it's so adaptable. But it's still a decent ability, and I think there's still merit to running it potentially, considering even if I, let's say, went with a very Phys-Def Glastrier, I could still gain a physical attack boost, which is pretty good. But at the same time, though, I can never actually tailor it to the stat I want. It's always going to be physical attack. So I think there is kind of a downside there, but it's still not bad. A tier. Chlorophyll, it's a weather ability. All the weather abilities honestly get S tier. Being able to double your speed is such a huge thing because most Pokemon, even with a Choice Scarf, cannot pace you at that point. And on top of that as well, a lot of Chlorophyll Pokemon will get moves to take advantage of the weather further. For example, Venusaur gets Weather Ball or Solar Beam as well, both of which are able to take advantage of Sun and become absolutely monstrous for those Chlorophyll Pokemon. So easily a top tier ability. Clear Body, I can't lie, before I would have probably put this in average, but after playing a lot of VGC, I think this is a strong ability. Making sure that in doubles, a Pokemon like Metagross doesn't need to drop its attack stat from all the Intimidate spam is honestly really amazing. Making sure that you're just consistently going for a no attack drop Pokemon, or a no speed drop too if your opponent goes for like a max strike on your partner, or if your opponent maybe goes for max darkness on Metagross if you're Dynamax and you didn't die to the hit, now you're also not getting your special defense dropped. It's really useful in my opinion for especially the Dynamax meta, and I think that Clear Body really ended up standing out actually for Metagross. I think you could make a case for top tier just because of how influential Dynamax and Intimidate are. But at the same time though, I think that'd be a little bit of a stretch because in singles, it's not one of those abilities you would typically be thinking is a really strong ability. So I think it kind of averages to just a strong ability tier. I wouldn't say it's top tier. Cloud9's up next. Again, same as Airlock, we don't need to re-go into this. Color change, I would argue this actually gets detrimental. I think of the detrimentals, this is the least detrimental though, but making sure that your opponent changes your type for you, I think typically is a bad thing. There are certain cases where I think you could take advantage of this, maybe predict around your opponent right and go for a stab based on what they'll attack you with. But most cases with color change, your opponent will attack you once, then they'll go for an attack that will hit you super effectively and you're KO'd. And that's how it would go most cases. So I think that ultimately this is detrimental because it gives your opponent control of how to KO you as quickly as possible. But again, I will acknowledge of the detrimental abilities, I think that at the very least, you have ways to take advantage of it. So I think it's the best of those, I'll mention that right now, but it's still detrimental. Comatose, honestly, Comatose is pretty decent. I think this is a strong ability of a really weak Pokemon, but Comatose basically making sure that you're always asleep. You could essentially pull off just sleep talk sets, which is really useful, and go for last resort at that point, and you'll do some astronomical damage on a choice banded variant. Comatose, honestly, I think, in my personal opinion, is a really good ability, and it makes a really bad Pokemon usable in the very loosest sense of the word. Still not top tier or anything, but I think, again, the fact that you can't be put to any other status, you can't Toxic Solace, and it also gets Wish, you can't go for Burn and drop the attack, which I will say the one downside of Comatose is you can't actually take advantage of Facade because you're not technically statused, you're just in a sleep-like state. So you can use Sleep Talk. I don't think the Facade gets the boost. If it did, even still, I wouldn't actually put this in top tier, but it's still a really decent ability in my opinion. I think this is one of those really strong abilities that doesn't get a lot of showcase just because it's on Kamala. Competitive is really decent actually to take advantage of Intimidate users. I would say this is a strong ability. Anytime you get a stat drop, your special attack goes up by 2. If your special attack is dropped, you still get the +2 stage, but it would be afterwards. So it wouldn't ignore the special attack drop. If it did, I would put this in top tier. But let's say you're at no special attack boost, your opponent gets a -1 stage special attack, you would only be at +1 at that point. So if it ignored that entirely, I would say this is top tier. Because it doesn't, it's still a strong ability, just I can't say the fact that you're immune to those drops as well. That's because you're not immune to them, essentially, is why I wouldn't put it in top tier. Still really good though. Combat Eyes is an average ability. Making sure that you can boost attacks that would otherwise not necessarily be hitting as often is pretty useful. However, at the same time though, a lot of these Compound Eyes Pokemon are typically on weaker variants. For example, Butterfree and Vivian are two of the best Compound Eyes users. Actually, I like Galvantula is probably the best Compound Eyes user, but Galvantula also has a better ability copywriting being a nerve. But you get 1/3 on a 1.3 times boost to accuracy. This typically doesn't make a lot of the moves you'd actually be trying to hit guaranteed either. For example, if you're going for Sleep Powder, it's not 100% accurate. Going for Thunder on Galvantula, not 100% accurate. Hurricane on Butterfree, it's only 100% accurate in Rain. So, same for Thunder on Galvantula, actually, it's only 100% accurate in Rain. So, I would say this is average. It's not bad, it's just not great. Contrary is a really good ability, I would say. This actually, I think, benefits the most from the Dynamax metagame, I'll be honest. But instead of getting dropped by any stat drops, you'll gain a stat. However, at the same time though, this means you can't go for stat gains because you'll lose your stats. So I can't go for a move like Calm Mind on a contrary Pokemon because I'll drop my special attack and special defense. So there are some negatives to it, but I think that the positives outweigh the negatives in this case, especially when you're considering a doubles metagame where there's so much Intimidate and Dynamax that drop stats. So I would personally say this is a really strong ability, but it's definitely not top tier considering, again, similar to competitive, there is an actual downside to this. Or more so for competitive, it's less of a downside, just not as beneficial. For contrary, it's an outright downside, but it is in theory such a strong ability, even with that downside, that it still gets strong. Corrosion, being able to toxic poison types, honestly, really useful. I learned actually when I was doing my fire type tier list that poison type Pokemon can just outright use poison moves, even if it's not just toxic on Steels, which I did not actually know at the time. However, at the same time, on Salazzle, that doesn't really matter. It really only matters for the status, because you have a fire type attack typically that can hit this anyway. So I do think that Corrosion is still a decent ability. I would put it in strong. Being able to poison steel types is actually really beneficial because you could just go for toxic and your opponent would no longer have a switch in. Well, actually, I lied. It wasn't the fact that Corrosion hit steel types with poison moves. I believe it was only that they could hit with a status. I think it was that it also worked on, it also worked on poison types, is what I was actually missing, which that is still really good in itself. I could poison a poison type or a steel type. There's no poison immunity outside of maybe like a toxic boost, I guess, at that point, or poison heal, which is still really good, actually. It's amazing at that point, actually. But I think at the same time, it would be better, I would say, if it was on a Pokemon that was bulkier. Even still, I don't want to knock Corrosion for that. I think in theory this is a really good ability. Actually, no, I'm actually going to put Corrosion in top tier. It's one of those things where I think it's, in theory, Corrosion could do a lot more if it was on a better Pokemon. Similar to how Arena Trap, even on Dug Trap, makes it really good. Corrosion is basically the reason that you use Salazzle at all, in my opinion. At least as singles goes. In doubles, you can maybe make a case because it still has utility like Fake Out and a really decent speed tier. But as far as singles goes, it really is the reason you kind of use this Pokemon. But being able to Toxic just whatever the fuck you want with some good utility like Encore, for example, and Disable, it's honestly really good. It's a great sub-toxic Pokemon for low tier despite being so frail. Easily a top tier ability. Cotton Down drops your opponent's speed with contact. This is a niche ability, I would say. I think that in theory it's really good, but Cotton Down also is typically not an ability you would actually want to choose, in my opinion, because it's really just on Eldegoss and Gossifleur, which both have regen and even Effect Spore I would argue is more useful. It's still not terrible, but I think there's just a lot better ways of speed control, especially when this is only dropping by 1 stage. If it dropped by 2 stages, I think there maybe be a case for it, but because of that, it's a niche ability. Curious Medicine. Curious Medicine, I'll be honest, I forget what this actually does. It seems like it's on switch in, it resets stat changes. It's a decent ability in theory, just I think that it's more so the fact that regen is such a good ability, but I think it's better than Cod Down at the very least. Like, this is an ability I think that actually has a presence, considering you would just outright ignore and just clear any sort of Calm Mind sweeper that's trying to boost, any sort of Dynamax Pokemon that's boosted with max moves. But at the same time, that it also clears your partner Pokemon, so I can't necessarily give this just a strong ability. If it only worked on the opponent, I would actually be inclined to give this a really strong ability, but because of the fact that it also clears partner, it gets average. Curse Body, if your opponent makes contact, you could potentially lock the move for a few turns with a disable status. It's a pretty average ability, I would say. This can definitely be really annoying at times, especially if you're going for a super effective attack, making sure that Curse Body can potentially ignore it. I think that in theory, this is one of those abilities that could be better, but it's definitely not bad by any sense. I think, it's actually 30% just regardless of making contact. Actually, if it's, I was kind of spacing the fact that this also works with special moves. No, I still would say this is actually just an average ability, but I think it's a really good average ability. Making sure that, again, your opponent can potentially just miss out on hitting you with a super effective attack later. It's really useful in that regard, but at the same time, though, typically this is on a Pokemon that would have a lot better of an ability. Cute Charm, niche, this is basically just infatuation. You can't guarantee that it'll pop on your opponent. You can't guarantee that they'll stay infatuated. It's a very gambly ability. Even still, you can't guarantee that you'll get the infatuation to begin with. Niche. Damp makes you immune to Explosion and other moves like that. I think it's literally just for like Explosion and Self-Destruct. Yeah, it's just Self-Destruct, Explosion, Mind Blown, all those sort of moves plus Aftermath. Definitely niche. I can't really think of a lot of cases where you would actively be wanting to run Damp, albeit maybe there's Pokemon that have also another ability in the niche tier that might run it, but I wouldn't say that I'm typically running Damp specifically with the Explosion in mind. Maybe in another meta where like Explosion was really common, but not in standard play at least. Dancer, you can copy any sort of dance moves like Calm Mind, Quiver Dance, Dragon Hits, etc. I'd say this is a strong ability. I think it's just in a really weak Pokemon. In theory, being able to copy the dance moves is really useful actually, because Oricorio in doubles, you can actually partner this with another Quiver Dancer and start popping that, or another Dragon Dancer and start popping that. But at the same time though, Oricorio is already kind of a really frail Pokemon. It's not the best, but the fact that you can actually pair this with one of the typings and tailors to whatever your team's weak to is really strong in itself. And I think in theory, this has enough uses to where it's not a terrible ability. And I think it actually is strong. And on another Pokemon, this would actually outright be broken. So I'll give Dancer a solid A tier. Dark Aura, this is an easy A tier ability. I think Dark Aura being able to be a 1.33 boost, or actually, I'm gonna give this top tier. This is just a better version of Aerolate, because while Aerolate will give the normal type moves now stab in tandem with the 1.2, Dark Aura just gives dark moves already a 1.33 boost, which is even stronger actually than an ability like Power Spot or Battery that would give a 1.3 boost to partner Pokemon. It's just above that Life Orb benchmark, which is really good for a signature ability. I think this is one of those abilities that, again, it's one of those things that borderline's broken, but I think that's more so just because Beltal is such a good Pokemon, and Dark Aura just helps it do even more damage on defensive sets. But even with defensive variations, stuff like Knockoff and Dark Pulse can 3-hit KO or 2-hit KO a lot of different Pokemon that are even just neutral. So I think that alone speaks volumes to Dark Aura being a top tier ability. Dauntless Shield, every time you switch in, this gets a +1 Phys Def boost, really strong ability. I think the immediate boost actually is really amazing for this. However, at the same time though, Dauntless Shield doesn't have anything really to take advantage of that boost other than just being really bulky. So I would say this is just a strong ability. Dazzling, immune to priority, say less. This is an amazing ability. We've seen Serena use Queenly Majesty, which is just its variation of it, to great success in VGC actually. This is a really top tier ability in theory. Being immune to priority is huge, especially in metagames where there's Pokemon like Grassy Glide, Rillaboom, or Extreme Speed on just really a lot of different Pokemon. Fake Out's also one of the most common forms of priority, and it's one of the most commonly used moves in doubles in at least non-Dynamax metagames. So I would say this ability is easily a strong ability. I think you could make a case for top tier actually, but I think at the same time though, the fact that this is really kind of niche in singles to a degree, but I wouldn't say it's like unusable in singles. But it's one of those things you're typically not using Dazzling Pokemon in high enough tiers for me to want to justify this as a top tier ability. Still really good though. I just think that, actually, no, I lied. I am going to put this in top tier. Being immune to priority is fucking awesome. Especially in VGC where, again, you're immune to one of the best moves. Top tier. Defeatist, detrimental, lowers your offensives in both physical and special attack by half if you drop below half health. Easily detrimental. Defiant, anytime your opponent drops, it's literally just a physical version of competitive, and I'd put competitive in the strong ability tier right here. So Defiant gets that as well. It's an ability that similarly, you don't get immune to the stat drop, but you'll still gain +2 attack every time it happens. So anytime an opponent goes for Intimidate, you're going, instead of -1, you're now +1. And I think that's one of the things where I think the competitive is better, but they're both still strong abilities, because typically one of the most common ways you'll drop stats is either speed or physical attack. Two of those don't actually affect competitive Pokemon. One of those affects Defiant Pokemon. So I would say that while it's worse than competitive, they're both still really good. Easily both strong abilities. Delta Stream, it's just a better version of Airlock because this outright changes the weather. Even if you switch out, when you switch out Ray later, they don't gain the ability back. And you can't actually change the weather even by switching in a Pokemon later on to Delta Ray for Delta Stream. This gets a strong ability. On top of this as well, you also actually lose your weaknesses for any flying attacks, which is really incredible in my opinion. Actually, I'm going to put this in top tier. I think the fact that, again, you lose your weakness to any sort of flying weaknesses is really good. This makes Rayquaza, for example, no longer have a rock weakness. At least offensively speaking, you'd still take rocks damage super effectively from Stealth Rocks. But you also lose your 4 times to Ice. It's now only 2 times. You're resisting Electric again, which is great. So I do think a Delta Stream is actually a top tier ability in my opinion. Desolate Land, again, another top tier ability. You gain immunity to water, and on top of this as well, you gain a permanent Sun Boost that can only be changed out by Delta Stream, Airlock or Cloud9, or from Primordial Sea. Even if your opponent goes into that Pelipper, it doesn't change the weather. This is an easy top tier ability. Disguise I think last gen would have been in the top tiers, but I think that because of the fact you can't pair this with the Focus Sash anymore, it's definitely a strong ability. Having a Disguise can be really useful, but without Focus Sash in tandem with this, it actually loses a lot of Mimikyu's potential utility on stuff like Trick Room sets and Will-O-Wisp sets for more utility-based things, same as Destiny Bond. It's still not terrible, and people actually do still use these sets, but it's definitely just a worse version of what Mimikyu used to be as far as utility bond goes. So, strong ability. Download. Download's a really good ability, actually. I'm putting this in the strong ability tier. Being able to gain an offensive boost based on whatever your opponent's, I think it's the stronger offense, I want to say, makes, even if whether it's weaker or stronger, you gain an offense based for a 1.5 stage based on the foe's weaker defensive stat. So if your opponent's lower stat defensively is Phys Def, you gain a 1.5 physical attack stat boost, and honestly that's really incredible. It usually can make sure you can basically guarantee these Pokemon, especially if you predict the boost right. And not only this, but it doesn't adapt later on. So if I gain a special attack boost on a Pokemon that has a really low special defense stat, and I'm a special attacker like Porygon Z, I just keep clicking +1 boosted Hyper Beams or Hyper Voices or whatever really, and I can just keep getting off some insane damage. So I do think that's really incredible. It's easily a really strong ability. I think it's just typically an ability that we don't think of as really broken because the only abusers of it are Genesect, which is really strong for OU, but it's really weak in Ubers, and then Porygon Z, which has adaptability. But it's still a really good ability in my opinion. Dragon's Maw. So Dragon's Maw is really interesting. This gives you essentially a 1.5 times boost to all dragon attacks. It's basically just a better version of Dark Aura, which I don't know why they didn't mirror Dark Aura with a 1.33. I'm actually hoping they fix that for Scarlet and Violet because I think that's just a better Dark Aura. So this is, again, top tier ability. If it was on a Pokemon that had actual coverage, we would be thinking of this Pokemon as like a really strong Ubers Pokemon. but because it's on Regidrago, which has coverage in Ancient Power and Fire Fang, you don't really think of it as broken. But in theory, though, this is an incredibly destructive ability. Drizzle. Drizzle is broken, same as Drought. They both set weather. These are two of the best weathers in the game, I would argue. Sun and Rain are both incredible. They enable Chlorophyll and Swift Swim Pokemon. All the weather abilities I'll spoil right now are going to get top tier. Just setting weather in any sense is such a good mechanic. It's one of the best things you could do for a team. So I would easily say top tier for both Sun and Rain. On top of this as well, with Sun and Rain specifically, these also give you offensive boosts to Water and Fire respectively. Even better. Dry Skin, Water Immunity, and on top of this as well, if you're in the rain, you gain HP back. It's a pretty good ability, actually. I would say it's average. I think that the one thing I will say is that typically a lot of Dry Skin Pokemon will have better abilities they can run, even as far, both on weather and otherwise. Heliolisk, for example, has Solar Power and Sand Veil, both of which I wouldn't say are outright better. There are definitely cases where Dry Skin is actually your best ability, but it has abilities that rival this. Jinx actually does run this ability, and it would be its best ability. Parasect is just a not good Pokemon. And Toxicroak, Poison Touch can be actually more beneficial in certain sets, but Dry Skin's also, again, really good. So I don't think it's outright unusable in comparison to those other abilities, but it has actual competition that makes you think, so I'm going to give it average. Early Bird, cut your sleep turns down to 2 for moves like Rest and just have sleep turns in general. I'd say this is a niche. You typically aren't really running a Pokemon that's going to be taking advantage of Early Bird really well, and it's an ability that doesn't really offer a lot in most cases. Effect Spore, when you make contact, 30% chance for a random status for Poison, Paralysis, and Sleep. Honestly, I'd say it's an average ability. I think it has decent benefits. Effect Spore, being able to potentially status your opponent, can be really beneficial. But I will say I think it would be honestly even better if there were just variations for specifically Para, Sleep, and Poison. All different ones. We already have Poison Touch and Static. Just make one for Sleep and have Effect Spore be that one. I think that would be even better personally, because then you could tailor it for the status you're looking for. Because sometimes, for example, if I paralyze my opponent, but they're already a really slow Pokemon anyway, and if I wanted to poison them instead because they were otherwise going to out-recover me, now I need to focus on getting them full parried, whereas with the poison, maybe the 12% was going to make a difference. So I do think in certain cases it can be definitely detrimental depending on the status you pop, but in most cases, honestly, just any sort of status is really good. Electric Surge, it's basically just terrain, but for weather. It's weather, but for terrains. Same as Drought and Drizzle. You gain a 1.3 boost instead of the 1.5 because it was thought to be so good on Coco in that generation, which makes sense. Even with Dynamax, it would be really incredible. And I'm kind of shocked they haven't nerfed the weathers like that, in all honesty. I still think even despite the fact that the trains got nerfed, they're still really good. And they make these Tapus and other Pokemon like Pincurchin, well, not Pincurchin, but that was a bad example, but like Rillaboom and Indeedee, really strong candidates actually for really top tier Pokemon in doubles, and also in singles too. They're actually both really good. So I would say Electric Surge is still an S tier ability. I don't think it's one of those abilities that just shouldn't exist, but it's a really strong ability, and I think that just having the fact that it can also stack with weathers is really incredible. So easy S tier. Next up, we have Emergency Exit. I can't lie, people aren't going to like this one. I'm giving this a niche. I actually think there's benefits to this. Being able to utilize this on a Spike set, for example, and then getting the ability once you've taken half to then swap out, bring in another Pokemon, and then just start going for offensive damage is really incredible in my opinion. I think it would be only detrimental if you just could not choose the Pokemon that came in, but the fact that you can is honestly really good in my opinion, and you could tailor this actually for some really good sets. So I think this is a niche actually. We have Fairy Aura. We've already went over Dark Aura. It is just the same thing as that, but for Fairy. Top tier. Filter. This makes it so that you take less damage from super effective moves. Filter is honestly a really good defensive ability. You literally only take 3/4 damage, which is really incredible because otherwise you would be taking 2 times. So Filter gets a solid top tier ability. This is just a better version of, it's just, in my opinion, despite not being really a better version of anything specifically, I think the fact that you're taking so little damage from an otherwise super effective attack is really good for you in my personal opinion. Making sure that stuff, for example, like an Iron Head isn't going to do as much to Mr. Mime, or that a Focus Blast isn't doing as much to Mega Aggron, helps these Pokemon actually have some defensive utility. So easy top tier. Next up, we have Flame Body. It's Effect Spore, but for burn specifically. This is one of those things where, just like Static, I think that these abilities benefit the most from the fact that you could tailor the status you want. So I think that with Flame Body specifically, I'm gonna give it average, but I will say that I think it's better than Effect Spore. I think Effect Spore, in certain cases, having the luxury of the roulette is good, but at the same time, I think it's also kind of detriment at the same time. It's weird. I think that you can make a case for either being better or worse, but they're both still average abilities. Flare Boost. When you're burned, you get a 1.5 special attack boost. Very strong ability, just on a really shit Pokemon. Drifblim typically wants to run on Burden for the speed boost anyway, because then it can go for Tail and Testing Bond faster. But at the same time, though, Flare Boost, in theory, is actually a really good ability. Making sure that you can get that essentially just special guts is really good in my opinion. Just sadly, it's not a Pokemon that ever wants to use it. Flash Fire. An immunity is never a bad thing, actually. I'm going to put this in the average ability tier, similar to Dry Skin. I think that typically a lot of these Flash Fire Pokemon are usually able to run better abilities. For example, Heatran with Flame Body is pretty decent, albeit this was probably the worst example I could have brought up. Chandelure can typically take advantage of Infiltrator, which is really good for getting around sub-Pokemon or screens. Arcanine has Intimidate, which is a really top-tier ability. There are certain Pokemon that do actually really prefer this ability. For example, Typhlosion loves Flash Fire because it is otherwise running Blaze, and getting a consistent boost every time you switch on a fire attack is really good. Colossal as well, not Colossal, the Centiskorch as well typically will run this ability because again, it's just an immunity, though Flame Body is still a really good ability to potentially run on that. So I think it's decent. It has its cases where you'd actually prefer running this, but I think it's another one of those just average abilities. Flower Gift. It's a really good ability and a really shit Pokemon. This is just one of those things where I think it's a strong ability, actually. Being able to give a special defense and a physical attack boost just by being in the sun is incredible. You could pair this with a Groudon, and it becomes an absolute monster. Especially if you were to pair this with, like, in theory, like a Primal Groudon where the sun is permanent, and your opponent would basically need to have a Mega Ray or a Primal Kyogre to stop it, or kill Primal Groudon or Cherrim. Honestly, really amazing in my personal opinion. I think the fact that this could, in theory, make these Pokemon not only bulkier on the special defense side, which is really good considering the fact that Sun not only is meant to typically be on Pokemon that at least are setting it, that are weak to water, but on top of it as well, they're also typically weak to ground, barring Torkoal. I guess it's really just Groudon at that point. Yeah, Groudon's also weak to Solar Beam, which again, giving that special defense boost is really valuable in my opinion. So easily a really strong ability. Next up, we have Flowerville. Flowerville's okay. I wouldn't say this is a great ability, but basically Flowerville makes sure that you're gaining, I want to say a Spidef boost. No, grass types can have status lowered. I would say this is a niche ability. You're typically not, I mean, there are certain situations where maybe you're pairing a Pokemon like Florges with the grass type, and that could be kind of cool in doubles, but it's only useful in doubles, and Comfey has a much better ability, so it's really just on Florges, because Florges has no good abilities. I give this a niche. Fluffy doubles your Phys Def, makes you weak to fire. This is a strong ability. There's just a better version of it in Fur Coat. Otherwise, though, it's a really good ability. Next up, we have Forecast. Changes Cast Form's type based on the weather. Niche, you need Weather Up, and on top of that as well, Cast Form's really shit Pokemon. It's niche that you're using this to begin with. Even something like Cherrim actually has doubles utility because of the fact you could pair this with like a Helping Hand or Heal Pulse, or I don't know I forget if it's Heal Pulse, but I know you get Healing Wish as well. With Cast Form, you just have no doubles niche. So next up, we have Forewarn. It's basically Anticipation. Only, I think Forewarn, instead, it just gives you the most damaging moves your opponent can get instead of super effective moves. So it's still not great. Yeah, it's just the highest base power, so it's still niche ability. Friend Guard. Friend Guard is fucking broken. This is an easy top tier. Friend Guard gives you 0.75 times damage from opposing Pokemon's offenses. Honestly, this is a really incredible ability. You can only use this on Vivian, Clefairy, Jigglypuff, and then other like Spupa or LC Pokemon. Honestly, it's a really good ability. I cannot wait until Vivian's in doubles again, because assuming that it is in Scarlet and Violet, this will be a really nice Friend Guard user, since it doesn't seem like Clefairy is going to be in the game, but we'll have to see. Regardless though, this will be a really amazing Pokemon in my opinion with Friend Guard, and in general, Friend Guard's just a really good ability. You get a lot of utility on most of these Pokemon. They're really good for helping really strong sweepers be insane offensive threats, easily top tier. Frisk, you scout the opponent's item. Honestly, really useful in my opinion. Making sure that you can scout for choice items or resist berries is really valuable. I would say this is a strong ability. I wouldn't say it's top tier. I think that in certain cases, it's just information that you've already known, like leftovers when you've already seen leftovers go off, or Life Orb when you've already seen it go off. So it's not always a useful ability, but still really valuable. Full Metal Body. This is just Clear Body, but better, because you actually can't get through this even with Mold Breaker. So this is honestly a top tier ability. It's just a better version of Clear Body, because even if your opponent has a Mold Breaker Pokemon, you can't ignore it. So Furco's up next. It's just a better version of Fluffy. I give Fluffy strong ability. We're going to put Furco in top tier. It's not Furco's fault that it's on a shit Pokemon. It's still a really broken ability in my opinion. Just a 2x his step boost, but no drawback. Next up, we have Gale Wings. It's priority to flying, but only at full HP. I'm going to give this average, actually. I think if it was old Gale Wings, it would be top tier, but the fact that you need to stay at full HP to gain the priority, the only reason this is even kind of useful is because of the fact that Talonflame isn't really a defensive Pokemon in most situations where you would be running Flame Body typically. And Talonflame thankfully has the speed to at least roost and then gain priority later on. But again, your opponent kind of needs to ignore you to let that happen. So I would say just an average ability at this point. It's no longer that no drawback ability that you just start spamming Brave Bird and Tailwind with or Roost and get priority for. It's just kind of decent. And you now need to run Jolly Talonflame when this has no attack stat. Galvanize. It's just the electric version of, actually I'm pretty sure it's just the electric version of Glaciate, I want to say, and Airlate. Yeah, it's electric type moves, but it's only 1.2 boost, so it's just a weaker version of Airlate. I still think it's honestly a strong ability. The 1.2 versus, they're all 1.2 now, I forgot. Even still, the fact that again, it's just one of those things where you're gaining a nice action, well, a nice new stab option, considering the fact that beforehand it would just be a normal type move. On Alolan Golem, for example, you could use this for Explosion and Self-Destruct to make them do significant damage to the opponent, which ends up turning Golem to a really strong wall breaker, potentially, on Galvanized sets. So, honestly, really strong ability. And Gluttony, as I mentioned before, this is basically just Cheek Pouch, but I think it has certain merits and demerits. Cheek Pouch, I'd put in the average ability tier. I'm going to put Gluttony there as well. Basically need to run a berry set, but in return, you can pop the berry at half the HP count that you would otherwise need. So for Agua Berry, for example, instead of getting below 25%, you need to get below 50%, which has its benefits, but I think Cheek Pouch giving the extra recovery also is really useful. So I think they're really give and take. They both have merit. I personally rate Gluttony slightly higher because I think the Pokemon that run Gluttony are slightly better, but I think in theory, Cheek Pouch could have uses where it's a better choice. Gooey, on contact, you drop your opponent's speed. Gooey is also by one stage. I'd put Cotton Down in niche ability. Gooey is just a reskin version of Cotton Down. So I'm putting Gooey in also I'm also putting it in the niche ability tier. I think if there's two stages, it'd be different. But typically, even on Gooey Pokemon, you're typically preferring other abilities, which I think Gooey is literally just on Goodra. Yeah, and they have Sap Sipper, which is really good, and Hydration as well for Rain can be kind of useful. I think that Goodra has more of a case to run this than Eldegoss does for Cotton Down, but still kind of niche. Guerrilla Tactics, really strong ability. I think, actually, this is a top tier ability. Gaining the 1.5 type times physical boost in exchange for just choice locking yourself is really nice because this does actually stack with choice items and they no longer have a drawback because you're already using the drawback for Guerrilla Tactics. It turns something that would otherwise be a negative on other Pokemon and essentially make the items for choice now just an outright positive with no benefit, with no negatives at all, because the negatives are already locked into this ability because you're locking in a move anyway. So I think Guerrilla Tactics is a top tier ability. You could actually make a case that this ability actually shouldn't exist. But actually, no, I think actually you could make a case that this should not exist. I'll be honest, I think the fact that you have no drawback in tandem with choice moves is really broken. They need to at least nerf this like a 1.3, 1.2 times boost in my personal opinion. And it's not that Darm is necessarily like some Ubers destroying Pokemon, albeit it's viable, but it's not like it's some outright broken Pokemon in the Ubers. I just think that the concept for the ability is outright uncompetitive, considering again, it makes choice items have no drawback when otherwise their drawback was the fact that you're locking a move. You're no longer just locking a move for choice, you're locking it for your ability too, and you're stacking the boost. You're either getting a 1.5 attack boost and a 1.5 attack boost, or you can pair it with Scarf and get 1.5 in attack and speed with the same restriction. Really broken, should not exist. S+. Grassy Pelt, in terrain you get a 1.5 times boost. It gets a niche tier, doesn't really typically come up in use, I'll be honest, but it's not terrible either. Grassy Surge, same as Electric Surge, you get 1.3 times for grass type attacks, really good in my opinion as far as offensive grass types go, and also the added recovery is really nice. With Electric Surge, you can't go to sleep, which is good for potential Spore users to stop them from doing that. Grassy Surge, you just get the recovery every turn, which is really good, and also you weaken ground moves. A Grimnag, special version of Chilling Knight, so that gets a strong ability. It's literally just special attack instead of physical attack. Gulp Missile, if you use Serpent Dive, you can launch a Pikachu I want to say it's, I forget what it actually is. For Gulp Missile, I forget the specific mechanics, but I know it's Surfer Dive effect. Yeah, it's one hit after Surfer Dive, you take 1/4 HP, and I think it's if you're like below half, you end up getting the paralysis, and if it's otherwise, you get the 1/4 HP damage. The point being is that this is a decent ability just on a really shit Pokemon. I'm gonna give it an average. This is an ability that in theory could be uncompetitive, but I think it's only uncompetitive on an obnoxious Pokemon, and I think on Kramer it's just an average ability. Well, I lied actually. I do think this ability actually in theory could be a really strong ability. Because again, if you put this on a Pokemon that wasn't as shit as Cramorant, and it's really the only reason that Cramorant, a Pokemon that's best stat is its 95 special defense, with offenses and speed all at 85, with an okay typing and okay coverage, and it makes this Pokemon actually kind of usable to a degree in low tiers. So I gotta give it to Cramorant. I think Gulp Muscle is actually a strong ability. Guts, it's just the physical version of a Flare Boost, and I gave Flare Boost strong ability. I think the one thing I will say is that Guts has a slight benefit of the fact that it is ignoring the physical defense, physical offensive drop. Flare Boost does too, but it doesn't really matter because you're using special attacks. They're still both strong abilities though. Easy. Harvest, in the sun, you can gain back berries with 50%. I think it's honestly a really strong ability. Making sure that you can gain back citrus berries on these Pokemon is typically pretty useful. And while you could make a case that, obviously, I mean, I put Chlorophyll in a top tier ability, and Executor probably wouldn't really want to run that over Chlorophyll. There's still Pokemon like Trevenant and Tropius that would run it, potentially, although Tropius is Solar Power, which I think would actually be the clear better choice there, unless you're a physical set, and also Chlorophyll, which is pretty useful. But on all these Pokemon, at least for Tropius and Executor, that also run Chlorophyll and Harvest, they're also really slow Pokemon. You don't really gain a lot from getting a speed boost at that point on a base 55 speed Pokemon, so why not run Harvest? Strong ability. Next up, we have Healer. This ends up clearing status, I think, for the partner Pokemon. I think it's like only a 30% too, which isn't even that great. Yeah, it's 30% chance to clear ally status at the end of the turn. This is a niche ability. If it was a guaranteed, that'd maybe be an average ability, but the fact that it's a chance too, it's kind of insane. Heat Proof weakens damage taken from fire attacks. Average ability. I think it's just the fact that Heat Proof Pokemon typically have better abilities. Like for example, Heat Proof on Bronzong. It's really just Bronzong and Roly-Poly specifically. It's not even the evolutions. But Heat Proof typically on Bronzong, you'd most likely run Levitate because it's narrowed immunity instead of just taking less damage. So Heavy Metal does twice the weight, so it's boosts like Heavy Slam damage. Honestly, it's a niche ability. I think that a lot of these Pokemon typically have better abilities. For example, with Aggron, you have Sturdy, and you can run that with Boots, and you're guaranteed taking one hit, if not two, and you're getting attack off at least once. With Bronzong, you have Levitate and Heat Proof, both of which I would recognize as better. With Copper Ja, you have Sheer Force, which I think is insanely better, though I know there are cases where Raj can just go for Heavy Slam sets and go for Heat Crash and Heavy Slam, which is pretty good, and I think it's really the one case I would actually run it because of the fact that you have multiple moves instead of just Heavy Slam to benefit from this. And then Duraludon has this as well, but it also has Stalwart and Light Metal. Honestly, Duraludon doesn't really matter unless it's doubles, which in that case Stalwart is the clear best. So, niche ability. Honey Gather doesn't affect competitive. Huge power, strong ability. Doubling attack is incredible. I think the one thing that keeps this at a top tier is the fact that I think it's similar to adaptability, where this is only the physical attack boost, whereas adaptability's benefit is it's only stabs. So they do kind of have their balances, I think, in my opinion. They're really strong abilities. Actually, no, it's all. I think this is actually better. The fact that you can make Pokemon that have outright no attack stat really good breakers, or even Pokemon such as Mega Mawile and Mega Medicham like absurdly strong breakers to where there's outright no physical switch into them. Even most neutral Pokemon are 2-hit KO'd. It's pretty incredible. Hunger Switch just changes the type that Morpiko's Aura Wheel does. Niche ability. I think the fact that you could definitely tailor this if you're smart into doing certain stabs that could be beneficial. Typically, it's just kind of a whatever ability. Hustle, 1.5 attack boost, 1.8 accuracy for physical attacks. I think it's a strong ability, actually. You could take advantage of this with Dynamax. We actually saw Durant in the earlier VGC metas become an absolutely terrifying, and it was considered one of the best Dynamax Pokemon you could use. Incredible. I think it's really a strong ability in the Dynamax metagame. Welcome home, Muscle. Strong ability. Next up, we have Hydration. Clear status in Rain. I think it's average, actually. I know that typically people wouldn't really say that they're running a Hydration set just because, but I think that certain Pokemon can actually do it really well. Specifically Manaphy, actually, on Calm Rain Dance sets. You can go Calm Rain Dance, Scald, and then Fielder. And honestly, you can make a lot work with this. Because typically with that sort of set, you're getting up the Rain, which is boosting your water attacks as well in tandem with the Calm Mind boost. Which with Calm Mind as well, it's just rest talk at that point where you don't actually need to worry about the sleep talk turns and maybe getting a rest roll. So I think it's actually an average ability in my opinion. Next up is Hyper Cutter. You just can't get your attack dropped. I think it's actually average. I know this is typically not an ability you're seeking out to run, but in theory with how much Intimidate's actually ran, Hypercutter does have its uses. Albeit, I wouldn't say that this is an ability that I'd be like really seeking out to run on a Pokemon, but Pre-Mega on Mawile, for example, it might not be terrible if you're trying to give up Intimidate, which has merit for discussion actually. Crabominable, if you don't really need to run a punch move, I guess, but at the same time though, Crabominable's mostly punch moves. I think that well, even still, you could run like Ice Hammer or Close Combat, and either of those are actually boosted by Iron Fist. Actually, I think Close Combat is, but I forget offhand. Even still though, just the fact that you're not dropping an attack stat off of Intimidate or just other moves, I think it's actually pretty beneficial, just how common Intimidate is. So I'll give it average. Ice Body, it just Inhale, you'll gain back 1/16 of health. It's just a weaker variation of Dry Skin, and I think I already gave Dry Skin average. I'm giving this niche. Ice Face, Inhale is a permanent substitute for physical attacks, and otherwise you get a one-time immunity to physical attacks. This gets an average ability, I would say. I think Ice Face, unlike something like Gulp Missile, it's not one of those things where you're actually seeing usage because of this. Actually, no, that's a lie. You actually could see Belly Drum set to pop. So I think that actually, I'm gonna give this a strong ability. I'm gonna keep this in average. I think if it was one of those things where it kept an immunity and you had to hit it with a special attack first, and even without Hail Up, and you had to hit it with the special attack, with Hail Up, I would see it just being one of those things where it just is permanently immune during the hail to physical attacks. So I would say, I think that it's an average ability. It would be really beneficial if you just kept the permanent immunity until you were hit with a special attack, but I digress. Ice Skills, 2 times Speed F boost. It's just a strong, oh no, it's top tier. I gave Fur Coat top tier, and it's just the special version of that top tier. Illuminate, no competitive effect. Illusion, you can bluff the last party slot in your party. Strong ability. It's the only reason Zoroark gets actual usage in any tier, because of the fact that you can bluff it and it's something else, and it's really broken. It's why Team Preview probably exists. Really strong ability. Next up we have Immunity, just immune to Toxic. I think it's an average ability. Most immunity Pokemon typically have better abilities, but the Toxic immunity definitely has merit. For example, Gligar not being able to be poisoned is actually pretty useful, but Snorlax has 2 other abilities I would rather run in most cases, and Zangoose would rather just run Toxic Boost, so it gets average. Imposter copies the other Pokemon, strong ability. I wouldn't say this is top tier. Actually, no, I would say this is top tier. The fact that Ditto ever gets any usage for anything at all is incredible. This is our top tier ability just off of that alone. Next up, we have Infiltrator. Infiltrator gets around subs and screens. Honestly, really useful. I would say this is a strong ability. Great on offensive Pokemon, especially really fast offensive Pokemon. Noivern can take advantage of this pretty well, for example. I would say that the fact that you're able to get around both screens and subs is what makes this a really good ability. Albeit not every Pokemon that has it wants to run it. For example, Dragapult, there's a merit to be running Clear Body, I think, in such an Intimidate heavy meta if you're a physical set. On special though, Infiltrator is pretty good. Chandelure can definitely benefit from it, but again, Flash Fire might be good on certain teams, or Flame Body might be good. But I think that it's just a generally really good ability on fast Pokemon especially. Inner Doubt, it's one of those abilities where, similar to Aftermath, you just take damage after contact, but instead of 25%, I think it functions as a counter. I forget if you take the exact damage or if it's double the damage you took. Yeah, so it's equal. So it's just Final Gambit and an ability. I think it's actually a pretty average ability, I'll be honest. It just, Pyukumuku with Unaware is such a good bond for low tier stalls that you typically aren't really running on Inner Doubt sets. But you could always throw a Pyukumuku on a team and bluff it as an Unaware Pokemon, and then switch it in on an attack that would guarantee KO it. And now your opponent's dead. So I think there's merit to it actually, just you don't typically see it. Average. Inner Focus. Inner Focus makes it so you can't get flinch, and I believe they also added the immunity to Intimidate with this, I want to say. Yeah, so it's also immune to Intimidate. I think immunity to Intimidate actually puts us in the strong ability tier, in tandem with the ability to not get flinch. This is basically the ultimate Incineroar countering ability, which is amazing, because you can't get fake outed, and you also can't get intimidated. Easily a strong ability. Next up, we have Insomnia. You can't get put to sleep, but you also can't use rest, so I'm going to put this in average. I think it's beneficial. To be fair, Insomnia Pokemon typically do have recovery. For example, Noctowl has Roost, which is pretty good. Mewtwo has Raw Recover. Gourgeist has Synthesis, so it's not something that's like an outright detriment, to be fair, but it's just one of those things that there is technically the nerf to the ability, so I'm not going to give it just a strong ability. It's still really good, though. Intimidate. Intimidate's top tier. There's no denying this. It's probably one of the best abilities, especially in doubles. It's outright, I would say, the best ability. At least the best for balance abilities, I would say. Intimidate being able to just drop both your opponents or any opposing Pokemon's physical attack stat, whether it's 1 or 2 Pokemon, or I guess 3 in triple battles. Specifically, I think it's only 3 in triple battles if you take the middle slot, but I could be wrong in that. The point being, though, is the attack drop is amazing. This is really good for allowing you to just set up easier with a lot of different Pokemon. It gives life to so many different bulky threats, in my opinion. It's easily an S tier ability. There's no denying it. Next up, Intrepid Sword gives a 1.5 attack raise on switch in. This is an ability I think that shouldn't exist. I think that unlike Dauntless Shield, where you don't have really any way to actually take advantage of this potentially, and even if you did click body press, it's not really that broken. Intrepid Sword, I think, is actually an outright uncompetitive ability. Being able to gain that 1.5 attack stat, which I can get why they did it. They were trying to make a really good sword Pokemon to be a really good physical breaker in an Intimidate heavy meta. I understand why they did it. I still think it's an uncompetitive ability. Making a Pokemon like Zacian just that fucking good. If Zacian didn't have a Intrepid Sword, it's not a ban-worthy Pokemon by any stretch of the imagination. It's not ban-worthy. Intrepid Sword is specifically the thing that breaks it. It's the sole thing that breaks it. Maybe you can make a case for Crown being ban-worthy still, but regular would not have been ban-worthy if not for Intrepid Sword. I only say that for Crown because Steel Fairy is already an amazing offensive typing, and having it on a really fast and obnoxious offensive Pokemon would have been ban-worthy for singles still, in my opinion, but Intrepid Sword just takes it out of the park. Easily should not exist. Iron Barbs, it's same as Rough Skin. Contact moves do 1/6. This is a strong ability on defensive Pokemon. It's really amazing on Ferrothorn. Easy A tier. Iron Fist boosts punching boost by 1.2. I would say this falls under average. Being a 1.2 boost for only punch moves isn't exactly really strong in my opinion, but at the same time though, certain Iron Fist Pokemon do appreciate running this ability. For example, Infernape with Mach Punch and Fire Punch is really good. Same as Thunder Punch especially. Helps it do more damage against water types, which would otherwise take hits from really well. With Hitmonchan, it's a pretty decent offensive ability, but again, there's a lot of offensive abilities that just do better. Justified, when you're hit with a dark move, you get a 1.5 attack stat. Really good on beat up Pokemon, otherwise it's kind of niche. I would say though, because of how good it is with beat up, I'm actually gonna give this average. Even still, it's not something you really only utilize with beat up strats. You could actually switch in Terrakion on like a potential knockoff or like a Dark Pulse and just start snowballing teams that way, because it is a pretty decent Dark Switch and it has rather okay bulk for an offensive Pokemon. So I don't think it's a niche. I think it just barely misses the niche to end. Keen-Eye, accuracy can't get dropped. I think, I'll be honest, I think it's average just because of how important it is to hit your moves alone. It's really the only reason though. Most tiers don't actually have a lot of accuracy dropping moves as common options, but I think just the fact that you're able to hit your moves consistently alone warrants the average tier. Klutz, immunity to items. This gets niche. I wouldn't say this is an outright doesn't affect competitor or detrimental actually, because there are actually sets that you could utilize with Klutz, such as Trick Assault Vest, which are pretty good. Or Trick Choice Item, which if your opponent, let's say, goes into a Mega or a Z Pokemon, you're no longer locked into Trick, which is, it's an actual benefit, I would say, of that. So I do think there's actual cases where Klutz is beneficial, but at the same time, though, it's definitely a fairly niche ability. Leaf Guard. In the Sun, I think that Leaf Guard just makes it so you're immune to status, I want to say. Not a terrible ability, but I think it's one of those things where typically a lot of Pokemon do have better abilities. This also, again, fails for rest, so I would say this gets average. I would say if Insomnia can get average, this is just all status instead of just sleep. So I'm actually going to move Insomnia down to the niche tier, just because, actually, no, I'm going to put it back up actually, because it's purely because of the fact that this needs Sun to be usable, and this is just consistent. So they both have the give and take, I would say. Levitate, ground immunity, easy strong ability. I think that Levitate mostly misses out on top tier despite being a ground immunity, which is one of the more valuable ones, because there's not really a lot of great Pokemon that run Levitate that can also then punish grounds back, which I think is really the big kicker there. The best option I could think of is Rotom Wash, which is really an exception to the rule, in my personal opinion, because Rotom Wash can actually really threaten ground types. At best, in these other cases, stuff like Carnivine, well, Carnivine can, but it's a grass type, so it already had the resistance, it didn't really mind it. And that's the other thing too. Carnivine is really the only other option in this case, but it doesn't even actually mind not having Levitate. So I would still say it's a strong ability. Ground immunity is incredible, but I wouldn't say it's top tier. Libero, it's just physical. It's a Cinderace exclusive Protean. This gets strong ability tier. Being able to change stab based on what you're going for is really incredible. Actually, no, this gets top tier ability. And I think this ability, same as Protean, is better than Battle Bond, and it's why I think that Battle Bond gets the strong ability tier. Because I think despite Ashgren having slightly higher viability than Protean, it's more so just due to Ashgren's stats. I wouldn't say it's the ability's response though. If the ability outright changed it there after like certain conditions, like just maybe dealing, like after an attack, you gain a Battle Bond boost instead of a KO. I think you could make a case for Battle Bond being higher. Well, actually, no, I think I've talked myself into moving Battle Bond up as well, I'll be honest. Battle Bond being, just again, it's one of those things that it's in contention with Protean, and I think the fact that they are so contentious for which one's better for a team, and changing your type to any stab, any move gets stab, your choice, is really amazing. So I'll put Battle Bond here as well. Why not? Light Metal, it's the same as Heavy Metal, and I gave that niche. Just this halves weight instead, so it's beneficial for taking moves like Grass Knot and Low Kick. Still niche. Lightning Rod, immunity. However, I will say this one's a missed cause in a lot of Pokemon, albeit Pokemon like Alolan Marowak do take advantage of this, but a lot of the times this is on ground types or electric types, in really just resistances. The only exceptions to that are Seaking and Alolan Marowak. Everything else is a resistance or an immunity. Still, it's an immunity that this gives Pokemon though, and it gives special attack boost, which is useful on at least Raichu, for example, and Mega Sceptile. So I'll give it strong. Next up we have Limber. Limber just makes it immune to Para, which is pretty useful at least. It's same as Insomnia, just it's immune to a really annoying status, so average. Liquid Ooze, for draining moves, this makes the Pokemon take damage instead. I think it's actually really strong. It's just one of those things we don't really have a truly strong abuser of it, but Tentacruel actually is a really decent rapid spinner in lower tiers like UU range because it has Black Switch recovery, you can't Leech Seed or go for Giga Train on it, and you're dealing damage to the opponent instead of letting them recover, and you're still rapid spinning a lot of hazards away, which is really good. So I think with the roll compression, Liquid Ooze is really good on Tentacruel in that regard. But even still, I think in theory this is really strong ability regardless, so easy strong. Liquid Voice, it's just a worse version of the strong abilities for like Aerolite, for example, because this only makes it stab, it doesn't give the additional boost on top of that. However, this works for a status as well, so in theory you can go for like a Perish Song set and pairs with a Pokemon like Lapras, for example, like, not Lapras, well, yeah, Lapras or any other water immunity Pokemon, and it will be immune to the Perish Song at that point. So I think there's give and take with it, but typically those sort of strategies are so niche because you're not really pairing it with a dual water type in most cases viably. So I would say it's an average ability. Next up though, we have Long Reach, avoids contact. It's one of those things where I think it's not bad, I just don't think it's great. This does get around Rocky Helmet as well as abilities like Rough Skin and Iron Barbs though, which is the saving grace. If it was just one or the other, it would be niche, but it's pretty decent. Magic Bounce can bounce back status as well as hazards. This is a top tier ability, I would argue actually. The added immunity to them and making them now on your opponent's end is honestly really lethal, especially when you're using this on a Pokemon like Mega Sableye and Hatterene that are really bulky and they can stay around for a lot of turns. Really amazing ability for defensive teams in my opinion. Same as Balances too, but it's especially good for defensive. Magic Guard, immunity to status and hazards. Again, top tier ability. I think these are pretty interchangeable for how viable they are, because while Magic Guard is an immunity for that one Pokemon, Magic Bounce, you could still take the rocks and status if they were already present on the field, for like a T-Spikes, for example, and you come in on those, or if you take Stealth Rocks and you come in on that. But at the same time, though, you can bounce them back so none of your Pokemon need to worry. So I think they're interchangeable for how viable they are. Personally, I rate Magic Guard slightly higher, but I could see a case for both. They're both top tier either way. Magician steals your opponent's item if you have none. So I think this is an average ability. Clearing an opponent's item actually is pretty viable. You can potentially use this for giving up, or for taking away stuff like Choice Scarf, for example. So I think it's actually really valuable in my personal opinion. But at the same time, though, I think that there are definitely cases. Well, I think there's just a lot better abilities for that Pokemon like Delphox could have had, and even something like a Klefki already does have. But it's objectively speaking not a terrible ability. We have Magma Veil. I'll be honest, I don't know what Magma Veil does. I gotta double check this. It seems like Magma Veil. Nope. It's actually Magma Armor. My bad. Magma Armor cannot be frozen. Gaining this ability while frozen cures it. So it's just Insomnia, but for freeze, gets average. Magnet Pull traps steel types. This is the one trapping ability I'm actually going to put in strong. I think that the fact this is only for steel types, definitely in comparison to something like Arena Trap or Shadow Tag, is a lot better, because those only have one type that are actually immune to them, maybe two in Arena Trap's case. Like it's still one or two that are immune. This is only affecting steels. I will say though, come Scarlet and Violet, this might become a better ability, but for now though, definitely still strong. Marvel Scale, Fizdef boost one status. Honestly, it's really good. It's just Fizdef Guts. Strong ability tier. Next up, we have Mega Launcher, boosts moves like Aura Sphere and Dark Pulse. honestly, really strong ability. Gets a 1.5 times boost for all those pulse moves. I think that boost is really incredible for it. If it was 1.2 like Iron Fist was, it would be average or maybe even niche at that point, I would argue. But the fact that it's a 1.5 boost is honestly really strong. It still has moves like Water Pulse to do even out damaging Scald, while still giving you the confusion chance. You still have moves like Aura Sphere, Dark Pulse, and Shadow Ball. Well, not Shadow Ball. Yeah, Aura Sphere and Dark Pulse, for example, doing insane damage because they're now hitting for 120, which is harder than a lot of your stabs are doing. It's the equivalent of a Scald on a stab boosted Cloudster, which is really good. So I think this is honestly a really strong Pokemon, especially with Terrain Pulse now. You can actually pair this on terrain teams, and it's insane the coverage this thing gets in tandem with the boost that Mega Launcher gets. Merciless on Poison Pokemon, I think this is a guaranteed crit, I want to say. I do actually need to double check that. Yeah, it's always crits on Poison Pokemon. I think in theory this is a really good ability actually. I'm going to give it average because it's a guaranteed crit, but it does have a pretty decent condition of needing the poison. Just Toxapex and doesn't really care about that. Mimicry. Secondary type clear status. I'm actually going to say this is a niche ability because of the fact that you clear your good typing with this with steel. You could have maybe made this like an electric, like a steel psychic or a grass psychic on terrain for psychic and steel teams respectively, or fairy steel on a misty terrain team. Really the only one that would be outright bad would be electric. But because you clear ground, none of the typings actually are really good. At best you're just a budget Sunfisk, and at worst you're outright hurting yourself. Niche. Minus, this needs plus to be on the field. I'm actually going to skip ahead. I know I said I was going to do P's, but it's the same thing and I'm going to forget to do it later. They need each other to be on the field to actually work. They're both niche. And even still, they only boost each other if you're running. You basically need to run 2 electric types, and that's terrible. Mirror Armor in versus stat drop. It bounces back stat drops from stuff like Intimidate or any sort of stat dropping move like that. Or I should say move instead of not like that because Intimidate's an ability. But the point being, it's still a very strong ability, I think. Just Corviknight typically isn't really ran in VGC. Misty Surge, it's another terrain ability. This gives weakening for dragon type moves as well as clear status, or makes you immune to status for 5 turns, I should say. Easily top tier. We have Mold Breaker, immunity to abilities. This is also a top tier ability. Albeit I will say there are certain legendary abilities like Full Metal Body, for example, and Shadow Shield. You do need the legendary signature ability from Terravolt to actually get around, but it's still just a budget version of, actually, yeah, I think despite being a budget version of Terravolt, they're both still really good. Just the outright immunity to abilities is something that can't be slept on. Moody, random stat boost. This is a ability that I would argue actually should not exist. Very uncompetitive. Well, actually, no, that's a lie. I think the fact that it no longer boosts evasion, I wouldn't say that it should not exist. I think it's actually now just a top tier ability because you're always positively gaining stats, even if for a turn or two you're gaining a negative in a stat that would really impact you, because you always protect around it enough to until you're now boosting defenses and speed enough to where you're actually fine. Motor Drive. This gains you a speed boost when you're attacked by an electric attack. At the same time, though, this is an electric immunity, which is pretty good. I would say it's a strong ability. Again, similarly to Lightning Rod, it's immunity, which is nice. It's just not really impactful. Moxie, it's just it's the generic version of Chilling Knight. So strong ability. Multi-scale. When you're at full HP, you're taking half as much damage. Honestly, really incredible, especially with Boots' gen. This is honestly a top tier ability. Great on Pokemon like Dragonite. It's actually the whole reason Dragonite has usage these days, and I kept it with Power Creep. It's such a good ability. Same as Lugia as well. Lugia is also really decent with that ability. We have 2 abilities left. One is multi-type, changes a type based on the plate that you're holding. I would say this is a strong ability. Actually, this is a top tier ability. Giving Arceus the ability to run any type in the game is really beneficial, especially when the plates to change its typing are also giving you stab boosts. It's just a better version of Arceus system. Top tier ability. And finally, we have Mummy. When you make contact with this ability, you end up trading the ability. Actually, your opponent copies the ability. It doesn't trade it. It's not Wandering Spirit. So your opponent now has Mummy if they make contact with you, which is really good, actually. You can clear their ability potentially. However, the downside, though, is that you could potentially get this passed on to your own Pokemon because it's sort of a chain curse thing until they switch. So because of the fact that you could potentially inherit this ability, I'm going to give it average. Hopefully you guys enjoyed part 1 of the ability tier list. I know this is really long, but we have to go through 134 abilities, including plus today. So actually 137 including plus today. So we had clearly a lot of abilities to go through. Hopefully you guys understand and why this is a 2-parter now, because otherwise this video would be nearly 3 hours. Next week's video should be shorter. Friday's video should be shorter because we'll be doing a lot of duplicates or similarly skinned abilities, so it should go a little quicker. But if you guys enjoy this type of content, you want to see more tier lists like it, leave a like below. Next week's tier list on Monday will be dark, but comment down below so I know what types to do afterwards. So our next 2 tier lists, Friday for part 2 for abilities, and Monday is going to be dark. With that said though, shout out to our channel members being Zeke0, Josh aka Ultra Player, and Mia. I appreciate your support a ton. And if you want to become a channel member, links in the description to that, as well as Discord and Twitter to follow me for more updates and videos. And I will see you guys in the next one. Until then, peace out, guys.